it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 6th of 7 lectures in this year's lecture series on Food for Thought, History, Technology, Gastronomy. I've been able to, I've had the pleasure of co-organizing the lecture series this year with Steve Strauss from the College of Forestry. And the lecture series is supported by the Horning Endowment in the Humanities in the History Department, by the Outreach and Biotechnology Program, with support from the Waite and Lois Rising Lectureship Fund in the College of Agricultural Sciences. So we are a truly interdisciplinary series this year. We have one more lecture this academic year in our Food for Thought series, and the last lecture in this year's series will be given by Stephen Chapin of Harvard University, and that lecture is in this room at 7 in the evening on a Thursday evening, May 15th. And Stephen Chapin will be talking about eating locally, about local foods, organic foods, locavores as they're often called. And the title of his lecture, which you may have seen on some of the posters, is Eating Good in the Neighborhood, the Medical and Moral History of Dietary Localism. So it's a historical lecture with some contemporary points of view in it. Tonight's lecture is by Daniel J. Kevles of Yale University, where he is the Stanford Woodward Professor of History. Professor Kevles, previously, before he came to Yale in 2001, was for many years the Kepley Professor of Humanities at Caltech. At Caltech, he directed the program in science, ethics, and policy, and he, among other things, there was the executive officer for the Humanities Division, and he was chair of the faculty, our sort of faculty senate. Professor Kevles is known, however, not mainly as administrator, although he certainly is known as a good academic citizen, but as a prolific and original and very important scholar in American history and in the history of science and medicine. His first book was written on the American physics community. This book is an award-winning book that has become a classic in the field, looking at the constitution of the physicists as a scientific community in this country, which came, as I think we all know, in a general kind of way, to a particular kind of elite power during and then after the Second World War. And he examined the way in which that happened in a very original way that has been imitated since by a lot of other people. He's written other prize-winning books in a variety of fields. One of his books on eugenics, The Genetics and the Uses of Human Heredity, was serialized in The New Yorker and appeared there, where many people read it for the first time. And there, among other things, showed that Dan Kevles is someone who's not only a scholar, but he's also a public scholar who has appealed and who has spoken to a large public in this country. He also co-edited a book with the geneticist Leroy Hood called The Code of Codes, that some of you may have read or used in classrooms, Scientific and Social Issues in the Human Genome Project. And indeed, Dan Kevles, the last time he was here, spoke on the Human Genome Project in the Horning series. I'll mention one more of his publications, which is perhaps the most controversial of his books, on the Baltimore case, a trial of politics, science, and character, which dealt, as most of his work does, both with technical scientific issues, but also with questions that have to do with ethics, politics, and the law. And that book is another book that I could highly recommend to you if you've not already read it. Dan Kevles has long been recognized for his pioneering and original work on science and society, in which he has looked at the ways in which researchers, primarily in American scientific communities, have faced and dealt with different political and ethical and legal issues in the course of their scientific work. His current work deals with history since the 18th century, extending into the 20th century, of intellectual property rights and the patenting of new animals and plants, and the question of how one can go about claiming ownership to plants and animals commercially as well as intellectually. Dan Kevles was one of the first lecturers in the Horning series when the series began in 1994 and 1995, and it's a real pleasure to welcome him again to Corvallis, and I hope you will enjoy welcoming him with me. His topic tonight, which we haven't got on the screen yet, is the apples of our eyes, innovation, art, and ownership in American fruits. Thank you.
Sorry to put you in the dark. This will help you see the screen better, though. Thank you very much, Mary Jo. It's a pleasure to return here and to be welcomed so generously by Mary Jo and her husband, Bob Nye, now just in his first year as emeritus here at Oregon State. It's also an honor to have the opportunity once again to give a Horning lecture. The talk I'm going to give you, that I'm going to deal with tonight, the subject I'm going to deal with tonight is part of a work in progress, as Mary Jo mentioned at the end of her kind introduction. If you have any comments, criticisms, or so on to suggest in the discussion period, I'd be glad to hear them, because these are really ideas. I'm going to present to you ideas that I'm trying to work out. So let me begin then. I'm going to talk about apples in part. The apple is truly a remarkable fruit. In the Garden of Eden, the apple was apocryphally, as you know, the fruit from the tree of knowledge. And here you see an advertisement for the golden delicious apple, about which a bit more later. I will try to persuade you that the golden delicious, in a sense, entails in its body a part of the big story that I want to convey to you tonight. What I intend to do this evening is to show you that the small sphere of the apple, including the golden delicious in particular, reveals upon scrutiny historical knowledge of multiple interlocking subjects: the nursery business, plant innovation, the art of fruits, heredity and reproduction in fruit trees, the market for fruit trees, and last but not least, intellectual property protection in living matter, particularly fruit trees. Now, to turn back briefly to our colonial days, when Americans first came to North America, that is, white Americans, they quickly began supplementing the native fruits by introducing stalwarts from the Old World, notably apple, pear, peach, and cherry trees, in the form of seeds and seedlings that farmers and orchardists then sowed literally by the thousands. By the time of the Revolution, apple trees were most common in the nation's orchards, followed probably by peaches, with pears running a close third, I think. Apple orchards were mainly devoted to the production of cider and apple brandy, known as Applejack, and peach orchards were primarily given over to the making of peach brandy. Since for most sugar was rarely to be had in the 18th century, farmers treasured their apples, whether consumed in liquid or solid form, and children also drank alcoholic cider along with their parents. They treasured their apples in liquid or solid form as a convenient source of sweetness directly on the palate and in cooking. At the end of the 18th century, the commercial market for fruits was confined to what could be reached by wagon or water, and thus limited to the distance that could be covered before the fruits went bad. Most fruits were indeed grown for local consumption rather than market consumption. Under the circumstances, there were few commercial incentives to provide fruit trees or to invest in the development of new varieties. Most indigenous new varieties were the products, in fact, of fortunate natural cross-pollinations that farmers chanced upon in their orchards and fields. The thousands of apple seed plantings generated in this fashion a small but increasing number of trees with tasty fruits. Among them were the Baldwin apple, which appeared on a farm near Lowell, Massachusetts in the 1740s and was brought to wider notice by one Colonel Baldwin of Woburn. And the Jonathan apple, which was found on a farm in Kingston, New York, and made known to a local judge by one Jonathan Hasbrook, who returned the favor with an eponymous compliment. Yet for all these accidental innovations from the fields, at the time of the Revolution, most distinctive fruits of quality in this country had come from abroad, especially England and France. And during the first years of the American Republic, in the arena of quality fruits, the young United States remained very much a colonial dependency. But then, once the nation was founded and nationalism swept through its population, during the first half of the 19th century, a kind of fruit nationalism developed among horticulturalists in the northeastern United States. Centered in Greater Boston, it was led by members of the area's mercantile and then incipient industrial elite. Their fortunes made or accumulating, they embraced farming as a commitment to Republican virtue. To the end of agricultural improvement, they imported fine breeds of animals and plants from Europe, built vast greenhouses for fruits and flowers, and planted huge orchards with scores of varieties of the same trees. The fruit nationalists regarded and ran their operations truly in a spirit of noblesse oblige, divorced in the main from considerations of personal profit. In 1829, they established the Massachusetts Horticultural Society, finding in the subject it institutionalized a devotion to beauty and a retreat from materialism. They proudly exhibited their prize flowers, trees, shrubs, cattle, and sheep at meetings, offered prizes for improved livestock, shared seeds and scions with fellow cultivators. By the mid-19th century, however, American horticulture, as a result of these efforts, was coming into its own. By then, state horticultural societies dotted the land, and in 1848, several of their leaders in the eastern states initiated what became the first national organization of fruitmen in this country. They called it the American Pomological Society, as it was formally named in 1852. Pomology means fruit breeding. Exhibits at the biannual meetings of the society comprise as many as 6,000 dishes of fruits, the increasing majority of them by the time of the centennial of native origin. The fruit nationalists took increasing satisfaction in what they were achieving. In the late 1840s, Charles M. Hovey, whom you see here, a prominent nurseryman in the Boston area, and the editor of one of the nation's leading horticultural journals, began publishing a series of volumes that he titled The Fruits of America. And you can find several copies of this marvelous book, which is now a very, very rare and valuable book, right here in special collections in the OSU library. Part of what makes Hovey's book so remarkable and valuable is that it included 110 color plates, each a rarity at the time, each handsomely depicting the fruit, its stem, and its leaves. Hovey declared that he felt, quote, a national pride in, quote, beautifully portraying the delicious fruits in our own country, many of them surpassed by none of foreign growth, and thus demonstrating the rapidly developing skill of our pomologists to the cultivators of the world. Now, at the time Hovey was published his book in the mid-19th century, regional and national agricultural markets were emerging. The trend accelerated during the third quarter of the 19th century, especially after the Civil War, propelled by the construction of the railroads and increasing urban demand for meats, fruits, and vegetables, as well as ornamental plants, trees, flowers, and shrubs. Withal, the gentlemanly fruit nationalists were being replaced by predominantly commercial seed and nursery entrepreneurs, both of them proliferating at a very rapid rate. Eager to be competitive, the proprietors of these enterprises felt the need to offer new and superior breeds or varieties as often as possible of their wares. Some breeders were beginning to produce new fruits by hybridization and selection, but the large majority of innovations in fruit still derive from importation and chance finds in the fields. However, in this new market-oriented competitive era of market-oriented competitiveness, valuable chance finds were appropriated into the national market by commercial nurseries. Once found, they could be reproduced virtually identically by the nurturing of grafts or cuttings, that is, by asexual reproduction, and then sold literally by the thousands or tens of thousands. Such practices were well illustrated by Stark Brothers Nurseries and Orchards in Louisiana, Missouri, on the Mississippi River just across from Illinois. And here is Louisiana today. As you see, it's, you can't see, it's just a little print says it's established around 1818. The town was then tiny, and its current population is about 3,300 people. But Stark Brothers, the firm, which was established about the time the town was established, was one of the oldest and largest nurseries in the United States. It became very, very well known. It's well known even today, and still puts out a catalog. There is its logos. What it says is Stark trees bear fruit. Stark sponsored an annual fair that encouraged farmers to submit their good fruits. This is in the late 19th century. To submit their good fruits, including those of chance finds, for competitive judgment. In 1893, through this means, the firm learned about an apple tree that produced a luscious red fruit. The next year, it bought the tree with all the propagation rights, which is to say all the intellectual property rights, from its owner, who was a farmer in Iowa named Jesse Hyatt. One of the Stark brothers named the fruit the delicious apple. And there it is in a Stark catalog in the middle, and proceeded to market the tree to the world. Whatever their origins, whether hybrids or chance finds or imports, the improved variants usually required effort and investment to turn them into marketable products, a condition that made improvers increasingly attentive to protecting and capturing financial returns on the intellectual property that I'll refer to henceforth as IP in their new fruits. While they did not speak of intellectual property, they were certainly alive to the concept and were by no means indifferent to it. Now, a few words about intellectual property. The best known form of intellectual property protection is the common utility patent, whose requirements include the stipulations that the invention must be man-made and useful. What is patentable in the United States, according to statute, dates back to the patent law of 1793, which declared in language written by Thomas Jefferson that patents could be obtained for, quote, any new and useful art, machine, manufacture, or composition of matter, or any new or useful improvement thereof. That same language rests at the core of the U.S. Patent Code today, except for the term art, which has been replaced by process. This code said nothing about whether an innovation's being alive or not has any bearing on its patentability. However, in the 19th century, living organisms were taken to be unpatentable. Plants and animals were, after all, not understood to be machines or manufactures. Improvements upon them were not identifiable new compositions of matter. And how could one define the utility of a fruit or an ornamental plant, say a rose exhibiting a new fragrance or an apple of particularly appealing color or taste? Under the circumstances, through most of the 19th century, horticultural improvers did not seek patents on their products, but they did devise a variety of arrangements outside the patent system that they hoped would achieve protection of their IP in their living innovations. Now, in establishing their arrangements, the improvers recognized, at least tacitly, that they had to deal with two major difficulties. I will deal with the second difficulty later, which is this is a difficulty that's inherent in intellectual property protection. For the moment, let me dwell on the first, which is that the enforcement of any property right requires that the property be specified. That is, exactly defined or described. If you lose something and you want to regain it, you have to be able to specify it as your own. It's got your initials on it, it's your cell phone with your number on it, or whatever. This was easily accomplished, specification was easily accomplished and remains easily accomplishable with, say, tracts of land, which have metes and bounds. But it is not easily accomplishable, certainly not in the 19th century, with a living organism. For example, even a delicious apple. I set to you the exercise of writing down a verbal description of an apple, a peach, a pear, a cow, or what have you, in a way that exactly specifies it so that no one can dispute that this is a description of the living organism you have in mind. Now, the problem of specification was closely tied to the practices of naming in our case, fruits. Charles Hovey noted in Fruits of America that the proliferation of American fruits had been accompanied by a problem of growing concern to nurserymen. As he put it, a confusion of nomenclature which has greatly retarded the general cultivation of the newer and more valuable varieties. I discovered this afternoon, with the help of Cliff Mead, in the special collections in the library, where they have a treasure trove of horticultural books from the 19th century and even earlier, that this was also recognized as a problem in England, only though somewhat earlier, around 1818, 1819. In the case of the United States and fruits in this country, confusion of nomenclature was, if anything, an understatement. Fruits here were bought and sold under what you might call a riot of synonyms that only grew worse with time. For example, one popular apple, the Ben Davis, was also called the Kentucky Streak, the Carolina Red Streak, the New York Pippin, the Red Pippin, the Victoria Red, and the Carolina Red. There was another very popular apple called the Nickajack, which was sold around the country under 27 different names. In 1875, William Housley of Leavenworth, Kansas, a compiler of apple synonyms, called the tendency of so many old and fine varieties to be referenced in horticultural publications under new names, in his words, an intolerable evil and grievous to be borne. Now, why such passionate objections to the wanton proliferation of synonyms, to a mere confusion of names that has, after all, only to do with fruits? The reason was precisely because the practice lent itself to misrepresentation, fraud, and the misappropriation of intellectual property in fruits. In the rapidly expanding nursery industry, a good deal of seedling stock was sold by small nurseries and tree peddlers, who often hawked their goods at vast distances from the source. The distance combined with the impersonality of the buyer-originator relationship allowed some sellers to operate disreputably. For example, they might obtain cheap, unreliable stock, then tell buyers it was the product of a reliable firm, or sell it under the name of a prize variety of fruit, or both. Buyers would be none the wiser at the time of sale, given that the identity and character of a tree and its fruit often did not become manifest for some years, in the case of apples, for as many as 7 to 9 years after first planting. The disreputable agents might also somehow obtain seedlings of a good stock by purchase or theft, propagate it, then sell the trees or vines under a different name from the one that recognized their finders or originators. We must be aware, after all, that a good apple by any other name could taste as sweet. Under the circumstances, leading nurserymen increasingly felt the need to establish some means for providing authoritative information about the provenance and characters of the fruits that went to market. So the American Pomological Society had in fact been established in no small part to deal with the problem of nomenclature. On its founding, it promptly created a committee on synonyms. whose principal function was to bring order into the chaos of fruit names. It created a catalog of fruits, giving the preferred name of each and identifying the synonyms by which it was also known. It tried to link the name with a specific fruit by also providing verbal descriptions of its size, shape, and other distinguishing features, including, believe it or not, taste. The catalog also listed varieties that the committee, in its wisdom, judged worthy or unworthy, designating the latter for rejection by cultivators, which was probably the first attempt to suppress inferior fruits in the country's history, and maybe the last. A man named Joseph Cabot of Boston, a member of the Boston Cabot family, who had a good deal to do with initiating the rejection list, noted that the public announcement of such a list was a matter of some delicacy, as private interests may feel themselves to be injuriously affected, as he put it. But in his view, public necessity overrode such disadvantage. The catalog, as the president of the society held, was, to quote him, the best means of preventing those numerous impositions and frauds which, we regret to say, have been practiced upon our fellow citizens by adventurous speculators or ignorant and unscrupulous vendors, greatly to the injury of the purchaser and fruit grower, to the dealer and the nurseryman, and to the cause of pomology. Well, he said it was the best means, this catalog. I would like to suggest to you that the catalog was, in fact, hardly the best means. And though it may surprise you, I think that a look at the American Medical Association, which was established about the same time, reveals why. Medical professionals in the 1840s were eager to prohibit unqualified healers, whether quacks or not, to practice medicine. They had in mind that they wanted to both to protect patients and to limit competition. So the AMA accomplished both purposes in medicine because state laws were passed that granted it an authoritative role in the certification of physicians and in the establishment of best medical practices. The American Pomological Society, in contrast, did not have comparable police power, even though it did have, by the way, sections in every state of the Union. It did not have comparable police power in the bailiwick of fruits. Its only authority was that of moral suasion, which is to say that it had very little authority to enforce uniformity in fruit names or descriptions of fruit qualities. Moreover, the Society's verbal descriptions of fruits, those that were published in its catalog, were hardly exact. To illustrate with a few examples, there was the apple called Autumn Seek No Further, which was described as, quote, a fine fruit above medium size, greenish white, splashed with carmine, very good. Or the pear called Clapp's Favorite, very large, similar to Bartlett in form, but less musky in flavor. Excuse me. Vinous, melting, buttery, and juicy, fine texture. Well, wonderful descriptions, but any number of varieties could have qualified under such descriptions. I'm sure you will agree. In an evident attempt to add specificity to the descriptions, the catalog entries often included a cutaway cross-section in a black and white drawing of the fruit showing its interior structure. Now, drawings and paintings had long been used to identify botanical specimens, including fruits. Elegant versions of them were being produced in the first half of the 19th century in Europe by artists such as Pierre Poitou, and the transactions of the London Horticultural Society contain splendidly colored drawings. But good as these were, these pictorial renditions did not lend themselves to the widespread identification of fruits, even in small markets, let alone the steadily enlarging markets of the United States. They tended to comprise black and white etchings that were then stippled, which is sort of like pointillist imposition of color, as in the paintings of Seurat, or they were lithographs of fruits that were then hand-colored, usually with watercolors. Either case, as handcrafted creations, they were limited in number and difficult to reproduce faithfully. You can see some of these paintings, or illustrations, by the way, of fruits, again, in some of these marvelous books here in the special collections, especially the English ones and the French ones from the early 19th century. However, not long before the founding of the American Pomological Society, a new printing technology came to the United States that promised to enable the production of multiple colored portraits of fruits. Devised in Europe in the early 19th century, it was called Chromo Lithography. It involved impressing different colors on the same drawing in successive printings on the stone, sometimes as many as a dozen of them. The technique was introduced to the United States in 1840 in Boston by William Sharp, an immigrant from England who was a painter, drawing teacher, and then finally a successful lithographer. Charles Hovey enlisted Sharp to produce the colored plates, 110 of them in the end, in his Fruits of America, thinking that they might serve the purpose of authoritative identification. Indeed, in publishing the volumes that comprise the Fruits of America, Hovey had far more in mind than just simply celebrating the progress of American fruits in a nationalist vein. Indeed, he declared in the preface to the volumes that his principal object in publishing the book was in fact, quote, to reduce the chaos of names to something like order. Hovey counted the color plates as essential to achieving this end, noting, quote, the great importance and value of color drawings in identifying fruits and detecting synonyms, adding, they are now generally acknowledged when accurately and truthfully executed and accompanied with faithful descriptions to be the only, that is the color drawings, the only safe and reliable means of arriving at certain satisfactory conclusions. And here, by the way, is one of the illustrations in Hovey's Fruits of America. Hovey held that Sharp's first plates showed that, in his words, the art of chromolithography produces a far more beautiful and correct representation than that of the ordinary lithograph, washed in color in the usual way. Indeed, the plates have the richness of actual paintings, he went on, which could not be executed for 10 times the value of a single copy. Now, this was Hovey's view, but hardly everyone in the fruit business agreed, especially not the editors of the Transactions of the Massachusetts Horticultural Society. Hoping to publish reliable identifications of fruits, they had contracted with Sharp to provide chromolithographs of several fruits for the issue of July 1847. So here is the issue, the frontispiece of the Transactions. And here is a chromolithograph, one of several in the volume by Sharp. They found, here's another one. This is the Williams apple. The other one is, of course, a pear. They found, and maybe you will agree and maybe you won't, I don't know. They found that the quality of the prints did not convey the subtlety and texture of the fruits or the leaves, or even the beauty of Sharp's own original drawings from which the chromolithographs were made. The editor of a prominent horticultural magazine judged that Sharp's plates were more richly colored and more carefully executed than the plates in Hovey's volumes, but he concluded that they lacked, quote, that fidelity to nature and delicacy of tint which characterized the best English and French colored plates done by hand. The results were not altogether surprising, one might note. Chromolithography at the time was a very complex and demanding process. It required a sophisticated understanding of color, the inventive use of transparent or translucent inks, and perfect registration of the stone with the print in each of a dozen successive impressions. I mean, so there was no formula. You had to figure out the combination of inks, how translucent they were to be to produce, and make sure that everything was in perfect registration every time you put the paper with the new color ink on the stone. And that was not easy to accomplish. The editors of the Transactions in Massachusetts were nevertheless still eager for authoritative identifications, and so what they did was to return to prior art, that is, fruit portraits comprising black and white lithographs that would then be watercolored by hand. To this end, they engaged an artist named Joseph Presta Lee to produce 4 colored illustrations for the second number of the Transactions. Presta Lee was a German immigrant from Bavaria who had been a staff artist at the Royal Botanical Garden in Munich. He soon made a name for himself here as an able and impressive botanical illustrator, known for drawings of great clarity, accuracy, and minuteness of detail. Presta Lee's 4 plates, which appeared, here's one of them, which appeared in a volume of the Transactions in 1848, exquisitely depicted several popular fruits, including a pear, 3 pears, and a cherry. I leave it to you to decide whether this is better than the chromo lithographs of Sharp. I think they are. Even the pear you can see is bruised. And here are the cherries. They look better, I think, than a chromo lithograph. Anyway, it's up to you. Observers at the time who had disparaged Sharp's chromolithographs greeted Presta Lee's plates with enthusiasm, celebrating them as far superior to Sharp's pictures. However, although the editors contracted with Presta Lee for 4 more plates, they soon had to cease publishing the Transactions. Part of the reason appears to have been that the colored lithographs, though artistically meritorious, whether they were done by Sharp or whether they were hand-colored by Presta Lee, involved a high level of what the editors called, ruefully in one of their last issues, a high level of unexpected labor and delay as well as expense. Artists like Presta Lee did better in the commercial sector, among nurserymen eager to claim title to and advertise their fruit varieties. Presta Lee provided those who wanted them with plates that made the fruits appear life-size, with rich coloring and delicate blooms on the plums and the grapes. Unlike earlier plates, those often included cross-sections of the fruit, particularly apples, to aid in distinguishing varieties. Now here this is from a biography of Presta Lee and his family. He had 3 sons, all of whom were artists as well. I'll come to one of them in a few minutes, named William Presta Lee. But this is a description of the plate I'm about to show you. It's the Dannenberg pear. There it is. I didn't have the time to lighten it up. This was, as you can see, also with a cross-section. And it's a very, very realistic rendering. Perhaps Presta Lee's best client was the Mount Hope Nursery in Rochester, New York, which was in the middle third of the 19th century, one of the largest and most respected such firms in the U.S., known by its proprietors L. Wanger and Barry, George L. Wanger and Patrick Barry. They were upstanding nurserymen. They considered misrepresentations anathema, and they disliked exaggerated colored plates. And here you get very realistic colored plates. But I think it was probably only the large firms like L. Wanger and Barry that could afford the cost of regularly publishing catalogs with hand-colored plates. The smaller firms, which were legion, relied on peddlers' handbooks, which from the 1850s began to include colored plates, some of them by Presta Lee. One leading handbook firm declared that the purpose of its plates was to, quote, place before the purchaser of fruit trees as faithful a representation of the fruit as is possible to make by the process adopted. It also published a private guide for the agents, which advised salesmen to impress customers that they were God-fearing, upright, and moral, which is to say that the issue of trust remained important in the selling of fruit trees. In the end, buyers probably found more protection in the reputation of the fruit tree seller and or his agent than in the colored fruit portraits. And the sellers grew more interested in such pictures as a means of advertising fruits than in accurately identifying them. In fact, at the end of the 19th century, the problem of authoritatively identifying fruits remained pretty much unresolved. Which brings me then to the second difficulty in protecting intellectual property. Recall that the first difficulty is the need to identify it. This is not unique to IP, intellectual property. As I said, any kind of property required to be protected requires specification. The second difficulty is inherent in intellectual property. It arises from the requirement that, at least in this area of IP and most others, the product must be identically reproducible. Otherwise, the intellectual property in it would be worthless. If it were not, the IP in the product would have no value. But the achievement of reproductive fidelity posed a problem for innovators because living organisms reproduce themselves, unlike widgets, which don't. If an improved fruit tree or vine reproduced itself faithfully, or could be made so to reproduce itself, the original improver potentially faced competition from the purchaser that, in the absence of the blocking power of patents, could not be easily forestalled. The problem was especially acute with fruit trees and vines. Using asexual reproduction, nurserymen and orchardists could be confident that the young trees they sold would bear fruit very much like the fruit on the trees from which they had been derived. Yet the ease with which, say, valuable fruit trees could be easily reproduced virtually identically through grafting and thus numerously multiplied facilitated theft of the developer's IP. Competitors could and did purchase the trees or take cuttings of them from someone's nursery in the dead of night, then propagate them and sell them, usually under another name. Now, I'm sure that many of you in the audience know of Luther Burbank, though some of you don't. I've learned from students I teach at Yale. Luther Burbank was a very, very successful fruit breeder in Santa Rosa, California, who flourished there in plying his trade from the late 19th century through his death in the mid-20s. Burbank frequently complained about the theft of the IP in his fruit trees. He complained about it in the 1890s when he was starting out as an innovator. Here he is as the young Luther Burbank. And he was still complaining about it in the early 1920s when he was ranked with, here is his experimental farm not far from Santa Rosa. It's now you can visit his home and the farm out there. It's worth a visit. It's a nice little museum. And he complained about being ripped off in the early 20s when he was ranked nationally with Thomas Edison and Henry Ford as one of America's inventive geniuses. He tried to protect himself against such thieves in several ways. For example, he prohibited visitors from entering his property and his workers from removing seeds or cuttings. He kept his seeds and cuttings in a safe in his office. Here's the safe, still there. He also, this is the most common thing that people like him did, he charged very high prices for his innovations. Say $3,000 for a new plum tree. Here is Burbank's first catalog as a fruit innovator. Before that, he'd just been a nurseryman selling other people's fruits. This is in 1893. Okay, here is a hybrid plum, and you can't make it out here, but it says that he is selling all his stock, including all the propagation rights, for $3,000, which was a very, very sizable sum in those days. Here he's selling a plum, different plum, for $300 or $500, which is also a very high price. What is the point of the high price? The point of the high price was that he expected that he would get ripped off. In future, once he sold it to anybody, then people would propagate it, and he would lose out on the revenues. So what he and others did by charging the high prices was to attempt to gain in the first sale revenue that would cover his costs and return a reasonable profit. The pricing strategy was intended to capture what economists call all the downstream revenues of which thieves might deprive him, since he would be unable to control the reproduction of the tree once he had sold it. Even so, nurserymen repeatedly contended that they failed to receive just returns for all their investment of time and money. Burbank fulminated to the readers of Green's Fruit Grower, a popular journal in the trade, that he had been, quote, robbed and swindled out of my best work by name thieves, plant thieves, and in various ways too well known to the originator. Now, unlike Burbank, Stark Brothers, to come back to them, which did not breed new fruit trees but only acquired them, like from the delicious apple from Jesse Hyatt, only acquired them, was in the business of mass marketing, realizing the value of the IP that they bought by charging high prices would thus have been counterproductive to their business plan. So to protect their IP, the IP in their fruit trees, in the late 19th century, the Stark brothers trademarked them, using the trademark law that Congress had passed in 1881. And here you see several examples notice this is a $3,000 plum. I think it says here trademark patented and so on. Here's more of it. You'll see that they're in different places. It says trademark patented. And here, underneath here are also trademark, 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 and so on. These are the catalogs in the late 19th century. And by the way, they also show you how the color illustrations was appropriated primarily to advertising rather than to accurate renditions of the fruits. The aim here is not identification, but sales. So they used the trademark law. And as you can see here in the 1890s, the Stark catalogs included gorgeous paintings of their named fruits with a small banner beneath each declaring that it was trademark, or in the case of the gold plum, that it was trademark patented. The trademark, however, would not prevent someone from obtaining the tree or cuttings from it, propagating the wood, as horticulturalists like to say, and then, once again, selling the tree under a different name. Under the circumstances, beginning in the 1870s and with mounting insistence by the 90s, American nurserymen began urging the establishment of legal protection for what they called the rights of originators, or what we would call intellectual property protection. Some of the agitation aimed to expand the patent system to include coverage for innovations in plants and trees. The move to patentability was blocked, however, when in 1889, in a case called Ex parte Latimer, the U.S. Commissioner of Patents rejected an application for a patent to cover a fiber identified in the needles of a pine tree, declaring in his words that it would be unreasonable and impossible to allow patents upon the trees of the forest and the plants of the earth. The commissioner's ruling formed the basis of what came to be known as the product of nature doctrine, that while processes devised to extract what is found in nature can be patented, objects discovered there or bred from there cannot be patented. In any case, most new fruit varieties were not inventions because most were either imports or accidents found in the field. This product of nature doctrine, by the way, would prevail in American patent law, with one exception that I'll come to, until 1980. Bailey, a plant scientist at Cornell named Liberty Hyde Bailey held that plant originators should nevertheless be protected. In devising methods to protect IP in their products, some innovators looked in part to the means used by animal breeders. Animal breeders managed to warrant the identity of purebred animals by registering their pedigrees in publicly available stud books that by the late 19th century were owned by recently formed breed associations, such as the American Shorthorn Association, the American Hereford Association, etc. This system did not, of course, firmly protect the IP developed by individual breeders, but it did do a great deal to protect the collective IP of the cartel of breeders represented by the Breed Association. In 1891, Bailey told the American Association of Nurserymen, which was predominantly commercial in orientation in its membership, he told them there is no law to compel one to register an animal, but every breeder knows that it is only through registration that he can advertise, sell, and protect his blooded stock. And there is no intelligent purchaser who would think of negotiating for such stock without having obtained the testimony of the herd book. Bailey proposed that the nurserymen draw on existing trademark law to obtain protection through what would amount to a national register of plants that would be administered by the Department of Agriculture. The originator would send the department a specimen, description, and perhaps a picture of his new fruit, and the department would issue a certificate, a type of trademark, ensuring him inviolable rights in his innovation. The idea was that the public would soon learn to buy only from originators who possessed a registration certificate, just as they had learned to purchase only animals registered with the breed association. Now, a kind of de facto registry system had already been established in 1886 in the new Division of Pomology in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This division had been created in part to provide systematic classification of fruits, but it basically took over the standard-setting functions of the American Pomological Society, establishing a catalog of fruits and attempting to deal with the problem of nomenclature and description by hiring artists right from the beginning in 1886 to paint fruits in watercolors. The first such artist was Joseph Presta Lee's son, William H. Presta Lee. His job was to provide detailed drawings and paintings of particular fruits, including their insides and surrounding leaves and twigs. Some appeared in the annual reports of the Division of Pomology. Here is the Flemish Beauty Pear by William Presta Lee. Again, not a chromo lithograph, but a hand-colored lithograph with watercolors. His paintings are marked by naturalness and grace, as well as by painstaking attention to botanical detail. After Bailey's proposal in 1891 for a registration system, the Division of Pomology's de facto registration system was heavily used by orchardists and nurserymen, presumably to protect their claims to their innovations. You see the number of fruits that are sent in to the division. There's a registry book that goes by month and then year. The number being sent in goes way up in late 1891, and also the number being sent in come increasingly and even dominantly from commercial nursery people rather than individuals. The department came to employ or use an increasing number of artists to paint and thus to provide visual identification of selected specimens of the submitted fruits. By 1936, 50 years after its founding, when the portrait program ended, the artistic team, a total of at least 75 by then, at least 22 of whom were women, had produced all told some 7,700 watercolors, portraying apples, blackberries, and raspberries, currants and gooseberries, pears, quince, citrus, peaches, plums, strawberries, and numerous other fruits. You can see a selection of these, by the way, on the website of the National Agricultural Library. I think it's www.nal.org or gov or something like that. They're lovely, and also I think you can see links to them at the National Center for, what is it, Mary Jo? The National Germplasm Repository that's right here in Corvallis, which is linked up with the National Agricultural Library. Despite the considerable artistic merits of the registration system, it did not, however, measure up to Liberty Hyde Bailey's vision for IP protection, which, recall, included trademarking that would not only protect the name of the innovation, but also secure to the originator the exclusive right to the plant or tree and to its propagation. That ingredient, such an extension of trademark from name to object, was severely undercut in 1895 by the ruling of a federal appeals court in a case called Hoyt et al. Versus J.T. Lovett. The case concerned a dispute over the trademarking of a grape that came from the Green Mountains of Vermont. The court held that trademarks could not cover living products as such because, like the grape, they grew out of the earth on their own. The ruling in Hoyt et al. Nullified the hope of the nurserymen that the registration system coupled with trademarks would suffice. During the next decade, the leading nurseries, including Burbank and Stark Brothers, moved to obtain legislation extending trademark protection to their innovations. In 1906, at the behest of the nation's nurserymen, a bill was introduced in the House to amend the Trademark Act by authorizing the Commissioner of Patents to register an originator's new variety of plant, bush, shrub, tree, or vine. Registration of the name would constitute a trademark and would include for 20 years the exclusive right to propagate for sale and then such variety of horticultural product under the name so registered. This is basically Liberty Hyde Bailey's plan. The bill failed for interesting reasons that I don't have time to go into. Just to say summarily, it failed partly because the Congress found that the fruitmen were proposing to obtain a kind of patent protection through a trademark. And the constitutional authorization for patents is different from the constitutional authorization for trademarks, and hence they found the merger of the two unconstitutional. Nevertheless, the effort to get this bill in 1906 led to the formation of a lobbying group, the National Committee on Plant Patents, under the American Association of Nurserymen. Nothing happened for the next 23 years. That is, nothing happened until 1929-30, when Paul Stark of Stark Brothers became chair of the committee. Now, Stark Brothers had a particularly acute reasons for wanting patent protection of fruits at this time. The reasons centered on my introductory object of this evening, the golden delicious apple, with which I will now conclude. Like so many of its novel predecessors, this was the chance find of a farmer in his orchard in West Virginia. During World War I, Stark had acquired the rights to the golden delicious, had invested considerable sums in developing it, and had sold its seedlings by the hundreds of thousands all over the U.S. and increasingly in many foreign countries. It's now marketed on 5 continents. To protect its IP in the Golden Delicious, Stark required every purchaser, this was their innovation. Oh, I'm sorry, here are some of the watercolors done by the artists at the Division of Pomology. They're all hand-colored, hand watercolors. Okay, so Stark innovated a contract. Okay? Every purchaser had to sign this contract, which says that the purchaser would neither sell nor give away scions, cuttings, or buds. In addition, every Golden Delicious fruit tree seedling was shipped with a tag, which not only reiterates the terms of the contract, but says on the back that you get a $100 reward if you turn in somebody who is illegally reproducing this tree. Despite the contract, despite various types of intimidation, including, by the way, the use of Pinkerton detectives, Stark Brothers was nevertheless often subject to piracy of its trees and found that the contract was not easy to enforce. Frustration over the difficulty helped energize Stark's eagerness for the stronger IP protection that a patent would provide. The Starks were well connected politically in Missouri. One of them, not Paul Stark, but another brother, was elected governor as a Democrat during the 30s and almost beat Harry Truman in the Democratic primary for U.S. Senator in 1940. And had he won, the world would have been a lot different. In 1930, not least because of Paul Stark's connections and lobbying effort, Congress passed the Plant Patent Act. Now, this is a kind of odd patent act. The act covered only asexually reproduced organisms, and it authorized a patent to anyone who has, quote, invented or discovered and asexually reproduced, meaning you could find the thing in the fields, invented or discovered and asexually reproduced any distinct and new variety of plant other than a tuber-propagated plant. They didn't want to give anybody patent, that is, monopoly control over things like potatoes. Given its requirement of distinctiveness rather than usefulness, it said that the plant had to be distinctive, but it did not say it had to be useful. The Plant Patent Act was not a utility patent law. Moreover, it did not establish the conventional legal bargain that granted the inventor in a utility patent a monopoly right in exchange for public knowledge of how the invention was produced so that others could innovate beyond it. That's the standard requirement of utility patents, that they have to be published. In most cases, after all, with chance finds in the fields, there was no such knowledge to be disclosed. So in all, the Plant Patent Act harkened back to the 17th century, I think, when patents were granted as privileges in the market, that is, royal dispensations to encourage commerce in new technologies, often from abroad, or to reward courtly favorites. Indeed, the Plant Patent Act might well have been called the Stark Horticultural Privilege Act, not only because of Stark's role in its passage, but because it granted a privilege of intellectual property protection that was tailored to the practices and needs of horticultural innovators, where innovators means includes finding something in the field and successfully reproducing it and then selling it. Still, we have to recognize that for all its simultaneous restrictiveness and looseness, the Act was the first statute passed anywhere in the world that extended patent coverage to living organisms. Even so, enforcement of the Plant Patent Act had to deal with the first difficulty I mentioned earlier and discussed earlier. The first difficulty of intellectual property protection in living things, how specifically to identify the property. Like fruit innovators in the 19th century, applicants for fruit patents had to submit colored drawings of their products, but they were not very useful in specifying what was covered under the Plant Patent Act. But soon biochemistry assisted them in specifying their fruits, and ultimately so did, of course, DNA. With its successful sequence of base pairs that are unique to the organism, DNA provides exquisite identification not only of fruits but of all living organisms. More than that, in 1985, knowledge of DNA and the ability to manipulate it brought plants of all types, not only fruits, within the orbit of utility patents. The granting of utility patents to plants, of course, opened an entirely new range of public issues, including the role of multinational corporations in controlling or managing the world's food supply, and relations between the first world and the third world in the exploitation of the latter's genetic resources. But whatever these problems, it is surely safe to say that Charles Hovey, Luther Burbank, and Paul Stark would have been delighted, indeed, by the arrival of such unambiguous protection for the rights of fruit originators. Thank you.